Today we're going to look at one way to turn 3D text into exploding particles that interact with a live action clip. If you want to follow along, I use the first 140 frames of the clip linked below. This will be a beginner-friendly tutorial, so we'll be going through the entire process from beginning to end. So the first thing we're going to need to do is do the camera tracking. So if we take a look at our clip, we're going through this alleyway and we want to put our text somewhere down here and have it explode into particles and interact with this alleyway. So there's going to be a few different issues we're going to have to deal with. First, let's start with the camera track. Add that in, bring our media into the camera track and bring the camera tracker up here. And we're going to change a few settings because I want quite a few points to make sure I get a good track. So I'm going to bring the detection threshold down to 2. The minimum feature separation I'll bring down to 0.03, bidirectional tracking, and hit auto track. Once that's done, let's go over to solve, hit solve. Once that's done, we have a great error of 0.3. So this is probably a pretty good track. But since we added so many points, I'm going to refine it a little bit. So under maximum solve error, let's bring this all the way down to something like 1. And that's going to select all the points that have an error over 1 within the scene. And let's delete those. And then we'll solve again to refine. Okay, and now we have an error of 0.2574, which is actually quite good. So let's take a look at what we have. So we can grab a merge 3D, bring it down here, and connect up the second output of the camera tracker into the merge 3D, and then bring that up into the viewer. And let's right click and look through the camera. And if the points are too large, we can come back to the camera tracker, go to options, and under locator size, we can bring that down so that they're a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to make them pretty small. Something like that. And then let's just check our scene. So there's a couple things that I'm going to want to take care of. You don't have to do this, but if you want to, it makes it a little bit easier. You can see right here, for example, that point. As I go through, you can see that that was a tracker that was on the reflection, so it's kind of moving around. You don't have to get rid of these, but it might be easier as you're placing the ground plane to not accidentally grab one of these trackers. So I'm going to delete that one. And then just go through and see if we can find any other ones. There's this one. Even delete that one. This one right here also is on the reflection. You can see how it moves differently than the other ones. This one right there. And that one right there. And one right there. Okay, I think that looks good. Let's look at it through the perspective just to get an idea. I'm going to zoom out just to see what we have so far. Okay, that looks pretty good. You can tell where the walls are and where the ground is. So now that we have a decent looking scene, let's set up our coordinate system within the scene. If you look closely here, you can tell that we have this drainage channel in the middle, and that's pretty flat. And you can see on either side of that drainage channel, the ground actually slants up to the right here and slants up to the left here. This is going to make it a little bit more complicated. For us to get this ground to work properly for the particles to land and look like they're actually integrated with the scene, we need some decent geometry for this area. One of the things that would be really helpful in building out our geometry for the ground is to make sure that it lines up really well with this channel. So we're going to want the Z-axis to go right down the side of the channel. We want the X-axis to align with these little tiles in the drainage channel. And that way we'll have this nice flat area to start from. And then we'll build out our geometry from there. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can do that. So I'm going to come over to the camera tracker. Let's go to export, open up 3D scene transform, and click on unaligned. Well, the first thing I'll do is I'm going to grab this point because we luckily have a point that's right on the edge of the drainage channel, and we'll set that as our origin. And then we can shift select a bunch of points along this channel to align our ground plane. So I'm going to grab maybe this one, grab those, some on this side. That might be enough. Let me see if I set the ground to that, and then let's click aligned. Okay, so that's not great. We have our Z-axis is going off this direction, and then we have the X-axis is at an angle. We can keep on selecting. You might get lucky and it will line up on the first try, but if it doesn't, we can actually kind of do this manually. It's a little bit of trial and error, but we can do it. So let's take a look at that. So let's go to unaligned, and you can see we have the Z-axis on this pivot point from our origin. we can come over here and we can move the Z axis so it aligns with this by just rotating the Y axis. So under orientation, Y rotation, you can see we can move this and we try to line up this axis with the edge of the drainage. And then we can click align just to see how it's lining up. Okay, it's a little bit closer. We got to go back a little bit. So something like that. And that looks pretty good. Let's just check it. Okay, that lines up really nice all along the left side of the drainage channel. So that looks pretty good. But what about this x-axis? You can see the tile right here. We want that to line up with that tile just so that it's flat. So we can go to unaligned, and this would be the Z rotation. We're going to bring that X to kind of match up and be parallel with this tile. So the Z rotation is right here. We can bring this down, maybe like that. Click aligned. Okay. Now let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, that looks like it's pretty flat. We can double check it by, if we come up here, we can use the 4 view. And you can kind of see from the front view how this is lining up. And that looks about right. So this looks good. So once you have your scene set up, we're ready to export it. So we can come up here to the export, hit export. And then let me take a second just to reorganize all our nodes. So we're going to take the camera tracker, drop it in the media out. I'm going to bring my ground plane up here. Something like that. We can disconnect the camera tracker for now. We can just push it aside. I'm not sure if we're going to need that. I'm going to bring my media in over here and just give ourselves a little bit of room. Okay. Once we get it organized, we can just grab our Merge 3D and bring it up into the viewer. And then let's look through the camera. Okay. Okay, this is looking pretty good. In the point cloud, I'm going to change this to points. And this is just a preference. I like the points better. I'm going to bring down the size of those points, just to make it easier to see what's going on within the scene. So let's start building out our geometry. Now, the reason I set up this geometry this way, and we took the time to get that Z-axis to line up well with the drainage channel, is to make it easier to build out our geometry. We want to make sure that it lines up well with the live action plate. Now, if you grab points in here and then you right click and you can create an image plane, but it's going to average out from those points, and it could be a slight angle in the depth. And when that happens, it could cause problems with the interaction with the particles. That's why we went through the trouble of lining up this Z-axis. It's just to build out the geometry and accurately depict the live action plate. So what we can do is we can take the ground plane and let's fit that right into this channel. And then we're going to use that to base the side parts of the alleyway and get that angle. So let's see how we can do that. If we come over to the transform of the ground plane, let's unlock the scale. And if we bring it down in X, we can just bring it all the way down so that it kind of fits within that channel. And inside the viewer, you can grab the X and just slide it over. And we're trying to just line it up perfectly with that channel. You can hold down Command if you're having trouble lining it up. Something like that. And then we can just kind of check. Okay, that looks like it lines up well with the center of the channel. Okay. So now that we have this, now we can build our other geometry off of this. It takes a little bit longer, but it's going to make for better geometry. So let's grab ourselves a shape 3D. Let's drop that. Actually, let's make a second merge just so we can keep all our geometry together in one, because we're going to have several pieces. And in this shape 3D, let's go to the transform. And the first thing you notice is that the plane is going straight up in Y. So we need to make this flat on the ground. Okay, and we can do that in the rotation. We can just -90, and now it's flat on the ground. And this is the nice thing. We set that ground plane so it's on 0, 0, and that is perfectly flat on this grid. So it's really easy to build geometry off of that. It's square with the Z-axis, and it makes it really easy to line things up. If this was angled, it's going to make it a little bit harder to line everything up. So we have our ground plane. Before we do anything, don't move it, don't do anything. What we want to do is actually move the pivot. We can move the pivot over here to the left side, and then we can move our geometry over, and that's going to make it easy to rotate it to fit with this ground plane. So let's go over to the pivot. And by default, when we create a shape, come over to controls, you can see that the size is 1. So it's a 1x1 square right now. And we can come over to the pivot, and we know that if we want it to be halfway over, that's half, 0.5. So we can go, if we want it to the left, we go negative 0.5. And now our pivot is on the left side, exactly on the left edge of this plane. And then we can just move it over and line it up as best we can with the edge of our ground plane. Now that we have this here, we can unlock the scale, and then we can bring it out, and it would be Y, maybe something like 8. Okay. You can even, if you want, you can move it down some, so we can grab just the Y axis and then kind of push it down so it lines up a little bit closer to the end of this drain. Okay. If we bring in the fore view, then we can use the front view to rotate it so that it fits within the plane. Now, the important part about this is that it's going to line up really well. The geometry will line up really well when we do our particle simulation. One thing is, if we take a look here, I can't really see my geometry. So one thing you could do is in the controls, you can turn on wireframe, and then now you can see the white line from the wireframe just to help you line up with the ground. So let's go over to the transform. And what do we want? We want to rotate in Z, and you can see how it's moving up. And we're going to line it up as best we can. We're just going to kind of average out where we think it should be in the point cloud. And that looks about right. We can always check it, and we will. So that looks pretty good. Let's add in the left side. So I'm going to grab another shape 3D, drop that in, and we'll do the same thing. Over in the transform, let's change this to negative 90 so that it's flat in the ground. And then over in the pivot, instead of negative 0.5, we want to go 0.5 so that it's on this edge. So come over here, 0.5. And now our pivot is on this edge, and we'll bring this over to the edge, which honestly, you could actually type in negative 0.5 because we know it's a 1x1, and that's going to be exactly on the edge because that's where the origin is. But you can just move it over and eyeball it. It's going to be fine. So let's set up the scale. We need that to be probably 8 again. And then we can take the Y and then move it down if we want. So something like that. And then we'll go into the fore view again. Probably have to turn on the wireframe so we can see it. Come back to transform, and then we're going to rotate in Z and just bring that up until we feel like it matches about right. Something like that. Okay. And then we'll turn that off. And then now let's undo the point cloud just to check to see how this geometry is working. So if we look at all these like little, probably gum and on markers on the ground, they should seem flat to the grid. So if we look right here, you can see that just, yeah, that looks good. Like this piece right here doesn't move from that part of the grid. So that looks like a good lineup. Okay, so this geometry is going to work out really well. Okay, so let's put the point cloud back in. And now let's do the walls. The walls we can do the more traditional way, which is to grab a bunch of points, shift, click like this, you know, just whatever. Or you can grab all of them, whatever you want to do. And we can right click, go to point, create image plane. And that's going to make this image plane based upon all those points. The reason this doesn't matter as much is because the particles can come falling down, and we can move this plane through the floor. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So let's grab this plane, and then in the transform settings, let's go to scale. And if we just scale it up in Y, might be easier to see it from the, I guess I can use the fore view again. We'll be able to see, we want it to go through the floor. So there we go. You can see over here, it's crossed over the floor. Okay, we just don't want any gaps in the bottom. And so now we need to do the same thing to the other side. So let's go back over here. Let's grab some points. Shift select some points on this wall. Right click. Create image plane. That one's a little crooked, so we could turn on the rotation. And then we're going to use this Z rotation just to make it a little bit more straight. And then we can come to the fore view again. And then we want to make sure that that's extended past the floor. So we can come over to the transform, to the scale, and then we'll go in Y until it passes through the floor. Okay. All right, great. And now let's reorganize this because now we have this merge right here that's made when you do the create image plane. And let's unhook these. I'm going to delete that merge and I'm going to take these two and bring them up here. And we'll drop them into this. And now the last thing I want to do before we get away from the geometry, if we remember, if we come to the fore view, is that the ground here, there could be a gap between these edges right in here. And so what we should do is extend out each one of these geometries a little bit so they crisscross like we have here, just to make sure that there's no gaps. So we can do that pretty easy in the ground plane. Let's go to the transform and then we're going to scale it in X just to scale it past, right? And then in each one of these shapes, let's change this to translate, and we'll do it inside of here. If I do it over here, remember, this is the local axis, so it'll stay exactly where it is, and I can just move it over. If I do it over here, and you can see the numbers moving, it's using X and Y because it's moving at an angle, okay? So we just want to bring that past a little bit, and the other side of it is past this wall, so we're good there. And then we need to do the same thing on this side. So we grab this axis, the X axis, and just slide it this way a little bit so that it's crossing over, and then make sure that it's past there. So let's pass the wall. Let's go to the fore view and then we can tell. Yeah, okay, good. So you can see if we go to the ground plane, let me change the material to white so you can see you can see that it crosses over right here, and this one crosses over like that. So there's no gap at all. And then on this side, you can see the wall goes past the ground, wall goes past the ground. So we have a nice tight geometry, and this should be great for our particles. Okay, let's go back to perspective. Okay, and so before we move on, let's just get these shapes back to not being wireframe. So let's get them back to being solid. So I'm going to come back here, go to controls, turn off wireframe for each one of these. Okay, great. And I'm going to move all of this over to the side. Let's move that over there, something like that. So now let's add in our 3D text. Temporarily, let's unhook all of the geometry. And let's talk about where we're going to put our 3D text. So I think maybe we want our 3D text to be down here somewhere. So what we could do is we can grab some points either on the floor or on the wall to figure out where that location is. So for example, maybe I grab these points right there because that's roughly where I want my 3D text. And now if I come to perspective, we zoom around here, you can see there's my points. So that's where I know I can put the 3D text. Okay, so let's get a text 3D and let's add it into our scene. And you can write whatever you want in here. I'm just going to boom. We definitely need to shrink that down a little bit. You can see that it's going through the walls. So let's make it a little bit smaller right here in the size. Maybe a little bit smaller. Yeah, something like that. And then bring it up a little bit and then bring it back. Yeah, so that's roughly right there where those points are. And so that's kind of a good little spot. Maybe we want to change the color of the text. So I'm going to change the color to something like green. And then we're going to want to add a little bit of depth to this. So we can do that down in extrusion. Let's bring the depth out. And you're not really seeing anything because we don't have the lights on in the 3D scene and we don't have a light yet. But we can come up here and we can turn on lights and shadows just so you can see, kind of get an idea of what your text looks like. Okay, great. So now we have that. Let's make it a little bit more interesting with a little bit of a bevel. So we can just bring up the bevel depth and the bevel a little bit. And then you can play with this, whatever you want it to be. But that looks pretty good. Just a really simple 3D text with some depth. You know, maybe a little bit more depth, something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And now we can look through the camera just to see kind of where we are. So this is our text coming through and we'll have it explode. So the next thing we're going to do is let's set up our particle system. So at this point, we want to kind of figure out where are we going to explode this into particles. So I'd like it to be 3D text for a little while and then eventually just explode into the particles. So why don't we go to like frame 24, whatever you want in here. I'm going to use frame 24 as my starting point. From here is where I want the particles to start to happen. Okay, so let's move the text up here. And from our toolbar, let's grab a particle emitter and a P render. And in order to get the 3D text and the particle emitter, we need to come over into the emitter. And if you see up here, we have region. The region is where the particles are going to be created. And under region right now, it's just the sphere. But if we come down here, we can choose mesh. And when we choose mesh, you'll see an input come out right here. And so that's where we can take our 3D text and drop it into this particle emitter. And if we look through the P render, you can see I have some particles. Okay. And if I go through, you can see that the 3D text is filling up with particles. Okay, so let's go back to frame 24 and let's talk about this emitter. Okay, so since this is going to be the starting point, frame 24, we don't want any particles to be created until after frame 24. So let's bring the number of particles down to 0 here. And we're going to set a keyframe on a handful of these settings and we'll animate them over time. So right here under number, we want to animate that. We want to animate number variance. The number variance is going to add a little bit of randomness to how many particles are created on each frame. So this number right here, this is going to change the amount of particles. So if we put like 1,000 particles here and bring up the number variance, it's going to fluctuate per frame how many particles. So it's going to be 1,000 on one frame and maybe 800 on the next. Okay, and it gives it a little bit more randomness. And then down here, we're going to want to also animate the velocity. And the velocity is going to be the amount of energy that the particles have. Keyframe the velocity and the velocity variance, just like the number variance. The velocity variance is going to help with making some particles move a little bit faster than others, just to give more randomness. Okay, with those set, one last thing I forgot is lifespan. Right now we have it set to 100 frames and our composition is 139. So let's bump this up to 140 so that at least the particles last the entire sequence. And then we're going to go about, 4 frames. So we're going to big burst of particles and then we're going to stop creating particles and just let the particles that we created interact with the scene. So we can always change this later. 4 frames later, we're going to go up to something like 1,000. Actually, let's go way up, 1,600. And then we could do a number variance. Let's, 30. And then the velocity, let's bring that up. And somewhere around like 0.3-ish. And then we can bring the velocity variance up a little bit. And we'll play with these numbers more as we go. Okay. And so right now we have nothing. And then we have these particles and they're moving to the right. But we'll deal with that in a minute. And then we're going to go another 4 frames and then we're going to shut everything back down to 0. So we want 0. 0. Anything that we keyframe, let's bring down to 0 so that there's no more addition. And now you can see we have our particles and they're just stretching out at the end. Okay, so now let's fix some of this stuff. First of all, we don't want it going to the right. We want it to come down, right? So we can do that right here with the angle and the angle variance, angle Z and angle Z variance. So let's bring the angle here to something like -90. That's going to push it down. So now they're all falling down. And then we can use this angle variance to kind of spread them out. So if I actually, let's go a little bit further down so you can just visualize it. And we can change this angle variance. You can see how it's spreading out in X and Y. It's still going down in Z, but it's spreading out in X and Y, okay? And now let's take a look at the Z. So if I come from the side, you can see what's actually happening here. It's the depth of our 3D text, and it's all staying within that depth. It's just going straight down. The only way it's spreading is X and Y. So we can change the angle Z, and let's see what happens here. And then we can spread it out so that it's kind of going all over the place, right? And then we can change the angle Z variant and come down here to kind of spread it out even further. So now you can't even tell where the letters, almost where the letters are. And now we have this explosion every direction, very random. And you can play with these numbers and get whatever results you want. Okay, let me zoom out here a little bit. And let's just double check this. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I might want to see a little bit more explosion coming up from the top. So we can do that by using this angle variance and see how we can move that so that it's actually going really kind of exploding out like that. But you can see the problem as we go through, they're all just exploding out. We want some gravity within the scene. So one way we can do that is with a P directional force. And the default setting right in here is the strength is 0.1 and -90. And that's going to give you basic gravity. You see that now they're all falling down where they weren't before. Okay, so you're getting a nice explosion out, and then the particles start to fall down with like gravity. If you want, you can bring the strength down a little bit. So we could bring it down, and then it won't affect it as much. You can see as I bring this up, you can see how much it's affecting it. But I'm going to leave it at the default for now. Okay, so now that we have this, we needed to interact with our scene, right? We did all that work on all this geometry right here, and we want these particles to interact with it. So we could do that by using something like a P bounce. Let's add that into our scene. And we don't see any inputs. So just like the emitter, we can come over to region, and instead of line, we're going to say mesh. And now we have this input right here. We'll take our merge 3D, all of our collision geometry, and drop that in there. Let me just move this up, keep it organized. And now let's see what happens. Now you can see it's hitting walls and stuff like that. Okay. And it's bouncing all over the place. So let's take a look at how this looks within our scene. So I'm going to grab the particles, drop it into this merge 3D, and then we can look through our media out and you kind of get an idea of what's happening now. So now we have these particles, they're bouncing around like crazy, but you can tell that they're interacting with the scene. So there's a couple things. It's a little hard to see. One of the things we could do in the particle emitter, and we haven't talked about this yet, but we will get into this more, is the style. Right now, it's just a single point, a single particle point. We could do something like a point cluster. If I do that, now you can really see it, okay? Because this is a cluster of 5 points. And let's keep it there because I think that'll work out pretty well. Now we can really see what's going on with the particles. Okay, so we still got a lot of work to do, but it's starting to get there. So let's work on that bounce because it just bounces up almost as high as where it exploded from. So in the bounce, let's go to the controls and we'll just focus on these first two really. You can use the roughness too. That's going to help. It's almost like turbulence. It's going to make it less even, but let's bring down the elasticity. So maybe something like 0.7, and that's going to help with, you can see now the bounce is not nearly as high. We can change the variance a little bit. So that's working pretty good. Another thing besides the bounce, now we could keep on playing with the elasticity until we get it, maybe get it down like this. Another thing we can do instead of doing that is we can use something called the P friction, and that's going to give, as the particles interact, is going to give it some friction like it would in the real world. So right after the bounce, let's add in a P friction and let's see what that does. So now it's going to explode out, and now everything is like, as soon as it contacts the ground, it's just getting killed. Okay, that's a little too much. So in the P friction, let's go down here so we can kind of see it. And under the velocity friction, let's bring that down. I don't know, something like that maybe. There we go. And you can see how that's working. It's nice. It's coming. So the particles are breaking apart, hitting the walls, coming down, hitting the ground. And because there's an angle and we have our P directional, which is basically our gravity, all the particles are starting to slide into the drainage channel. And because we crossed over the geometry, I'm not seeing any particles slipping through. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Let me just walk through this. And so are we happy with the way it looks right now? There's a few things that we can try. In the bounce, we can mess around with the roughness a little bit if you want, and that just kind of breaks it up a little bit more. So if you're seeing any patterns, these are some of the areas. You can mess with the roughness. Inside the P emitter, I just want to point this out, depending on your situation. We have position variance. You can try that. You can see how that breaks up the pattern. So you can play with this just to break up the pattern. So if you're starting to see too much of a pattern, you can play around with some of these just to make it as random as possible. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is talk about the style of the particles. So in the P emitter, let's go over to style. And one of the things I'd like to do is we want the color of these particles to match this 3D text. So this color here, okay? So why don't we come into the, let me look through this render in the style. Let's open up the color controls. Now we can put a color here, but I'm going to leave this blank because what I want to do is make it the green color at first. And as the particles over time, I'd like them to change color. Okay, just for fun. So under the color over life controls, let's make this first color. We'll just make this that green. Okay. And if you see this bar right here, if you move your cursor over it, it turns into a plus. That means we can add another color. And this is the lifeline. This is the beginning and that's the end. So at end of life, it'll be this color. And we can just click right here. And maybe I want this color to be, I don't know, orange. And then I'll click again and the final color will make white. Okay. And so now we're going to have green turns to orange and then eventually white. But now let's look through the camera because I want to see what's going on here. And the way I'd like these particles to happen is I want it to stay green for a little bit of time to probably about here. And then I want it to start to turn orange. And when it hits the ground, I want it to be white. So let me move this down a little bit. And I'm going to move this over. I'm going to take a little bit of trial and error. So, okay, so it's staying green and then it's slowly turning orange. And then when it hits the ground, yeah, it starts to turn white. And you can change these colors to whatever you want, but you can play with this and then get the exact look that you're looking for. Okay, that looks pretty good. We can always change this later if it's not working. So the next thing we need to do is work on the transition. So in order to do that, we're going to have to set up a separate 3D scene. So this is not that bad. So what we'll do is we'll take this text and let me grab another merge 3D. We're going to make a separate scene down here for just the text because we want them separated. We're going to switch between the 3D text and the particles. And there's a couple of ways we can do this. We'll talk about both. So the text, let's just right click, we'll copy it. We're going to come down here and right click, paste instance, because I want exactly the text. You can just bring it straight in if you want, whatever you want. I prefer the green line for some reason. And then after that, we need the renderer. And then I need my camera, which is right here. We'll drop that in here. And then we can merge these two together. Okay. So now I have my text together with the particles, but I'm not seeing anything. And that's because we have our clip in the background of both of these. So it's just covering everything up. So let's unhook our media in. Okay. So now you can see the particles and let's finish setting up the comp. So what we want is this to be down here, merged. And if you click option and click on one of the lines, you can make the little router so that it routes. And then this is in the foreground. We want that to be in the background. So let's swap inputs. And now if we look, we have our 3D text and our particles together in the same scene. Now, obviously, we don't have any light. So we need some light on this 3D text. So let's take a look at this 3D scene for our 3D text. And let's grab a spotlight and drop it in here. And I'm just going to come from the, let's right click, change, make sure you're in perspective, make it a little bit easier. In the spotlight, we want it always directed at this text. So I'm going to go to transform and down here we have use target, click on that. And then we have this option right here called pick. If we use this, we click on pick and hold and drag over here. You can actually select the 3D text so that the light is always showing on the text. Okay. With that done, let's bring our light up. Something like that. That looks pretty good. We can take a look at the render. Oh, there's no light in here. So let's turn on lighting, shadows, and let's look through the final merge. Whoops. Somehow I disconnected that. Okay. How do we like that? It looks pretty good. You know, it's most of the light's coming from here. It's like overcast. So in this alley, so it's not going to be any harsh light. Okay. That looks pretty good. So let's work on this transition. We have a couple different ways we can do the transition, right? We have our 3D text. We could just come into this merge, right? And we could use a blend to just do a quick, you know, as the particles come up, something like this, you can just shut it off. But Let's make it a little bit more interesting. What I'd really like is the particles to eat away at the 3D text. So as these particles come on, I'd love it to eat away. So what we can do is we can use, if we look at the particles right here, we have an alpha. We can use this alpha to eat away at the render, okay? So let's do that. So we can just grab this, drop it into, just option click this over to the side. So we can drop that as a mask also into this alpha, and you can see what's happening. Now it's starting to eat away, right? It's starting to eat away at those, at the text, okay? But we're gonna have to actually, we wanna change this so it's just the opposite, because that's not working correctly. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but we needed to make this mask inverted, right? Because we need the solid text. If we have it the other way, it's not gonna work correctly. So in here, let's apply the mask inverted. That way we have the solid 3D text and then it explodes into particles. And then what we can do is we can use in the alpha here, we can use something like an erode dilate right in here. So if we do the erode dilate of these particles, so on frame 25 is when they start to come on, and we can put a keyframe here. And what we'll do is we're going to erode this out. So we'll go to frame actually, let's look at the merge, just so you can see how this works. And so once the particles kind of fill in, I don't know, maybe it's 30, and then we can use this erode right here. And you can see how we can, so like 4 or 5 frames, we can move this point until we pretty much get rid of the text. Okay, so somewhere around there. And so let's see how that works. So you can see how that's eroding out the 3D text and bringing in the particles. But then you see what happens at the end? The text is coming back. So we're going to have to do a little something. What we can do is we can swap out, if we take a look at this one, oh, as a matter of fact, instead of box, let's do Gaussian so that it's looks more particly. So now you can see it kind of eat away, but we need, actually, I want that erode to come up even more. I want the particles to be, I want the 3D text to just about disappear. Yeah, there we go. Okay. What we'll need is we need to swap out that alpha. So here's our alpha from our erode dilate, but it's following the particles, right? And so what I need to do is somewhere in here, we can offset it a little bit. So I'm going to go back a couple frames and I want to swap this out for a solid alpha. So what I can do that by grabbing a background, and this has a solid alpha. So if we look at the background, we just have a solid alpha, and in here we can merge that together. So if I take a look at this merge, let's bring the blend all the way down. So on this frame, I can make a keyframe. So we got our particles, and then by frame, 32, we're going to go to full alpha. Okay. And so when we look at this, you'll see it starts to erode away, and then it slowly will switch over to only the particles. Okay. So you can look at it here. You can see how it's going to work. If we look at the alpha of the merge, you can see it's just particles eroding out and then slowly erasing the background, or slowly erasing the 3D text. Okay, so let's look at our final composition here and just get an idea. Now, the timing of it, we can move around if we need to. So if it comes down, we can see it erodes and explodes. And then we have our particles landing and everything's looking pretty good. Yeah, that looks pretty good. It's a little bit nicer than just a quick 3D text, bam, all of a sudden it's particles. It's subtle. I think it makes a little bit of a difference. So the last thing we need to do here is just add some shadows within our scene. It is overcast, so the shadows are going to be they won't be that noticeable, but we do need some shadow in there just to really help integrate it. So let's do that. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. And so we just need a shadow pass, and we can do that. Let's bring all of our geometry over a little bit further, and let's make another scene. So I'm going to make a merge 3D right about here. I'm going to take all of our geometry and drop it in. So now we have all of our geometry in this 3D scene, and we have our spotlight here, right? So actually, let's take a look at this scene. We have our spotlight here and we have our 3D text. What I want is just a shadow pass. What I can do is we can take this entire scene. I want the 3D text to cast a shadow, but I don't want the 3D text in the render. So what I can do is I can come down here. Let's add in a override 3D and connect up our entire scene to this override 3D. And then we're going to connect that to the scene. So let's take a look. Now we have our 3D text and our light and everything like that in here. I'm not seeing any light though. And that's because in this merge 3D, we need to turn on pass through lights, and that's going to pass everything through. There we go. Okay, but I don't want that 3D text to be rendered. And that's where the override comes in. Inside the override 3D, we can come over here to visibility. And it's a simple scene. It's just the text. So I can go in here and do unseen by camera, unseen by camera. And that's going to take all the 3D geometry in here, and it's going to create the shadows based on the lighting, but it's not going to render out the geometry. Okay, so we take a look at this and we add a render. Take a look at the render. Right now, the render doesn't have any lighting, so we can turn on lighting and shadows, and there we go. Now we have lighting and shadows. Okay, so this is starting to look good, but we have a problem. We don't want the geometry in here. We don't want it to be lit. Another thing we can do is we have all of these planes, all of this geometry, and in each one of these, if we went to material, each one of the materials has an option to receive lighting. And if we turn that off, you can see it's not receiving the shadow from the light. It's not receiving the darkness. It's just plain, but it's still receiving the shadows. Now we can go into each one of these and change this setting, or we can do something like this, which might be a little bit faster. We can do a replace material, and we'll just shift, grab, put that right in here. And we're going to replace the material with, I don't know, maybe a blend, and add that in, right? And in this blend, what we can do is right here in the blend, we can turn off the lighting, and there, it's going to do all of it for us. And that's just a little bit easier. But you can do it either way. You can go into each one of these and turn off the material, or you can just replace the material with this blend, and now we have our shadow pass. And then we can take our shadow pass and then merge it over the very end like this. And in that merge, we'll just set this to multiply. And now we're getting our shadow. Now, obviously that is too much. Now we have a couple options. We can either use the spotlight and come in here to the controls, and under shadows, we can start messing around with these controls to get the shadow to be a little bit softer and all that kind of thing if we want. So that's a possibility, but we're going to probably do this a little bit different, and I'll show you why. Because right now we have the text that looks pretty good, right? As we go through, other than the softness, but then we have the particles, and we need shadows from the particle cloud also a little bit. Now I can put this into the 3D scene. Okay. So let me option click. So we can bring our particles into this 3D scene. And if we look really close, you can see down here, we're getting shadows from the particles. Now this is overcast, right? There's two things that happened, and I'm not sure what's up with this. If I put in the current version I'm using of Fusion, if I were to put an override in here, the whole thing will crash. Because right now, if we look at this scene, it's rendering the particles and the shadows. I'd like to remove those shadows, but if I put in an override 3D right in here right now, it's going to crash it. For this particular scenario, it's not a big deal, because in order to show this shadow, it's almost going to not show up at all, because we need to blur this. So instead of bringing in the 3D particles, we're going to do a little something different. I'm going to undo that particles, and we're going to use an animated blur right here to help make everything fit in. So let's grab a blur and drop that in. And in the blur, we can just kind of change the size. And if we want, we can even unlock it, and we can stretch it out a little bit like this. And we can even blend it down if it's too dark, whatever we want to do. I'm just going to blur this like that. Let me see. Yeah, because that's about all it should get, right? It's just a little bit. It might actually even be too dark, but we can deal with that later. So we're on frame 24 is when the transition happens. So in the blur, let's put a keyframe on the X and Y blur, and then we're going to go like this until the particles are about to fall. And then let's try to blur this out a little bit further. Something like, you can just play with this. You can kind of see, if we take a look at our merge here, it's very subtle. Okay, let's see how that looks. So we come through, and the particle, as it bursts into particles, the shadow starts to fade. I mean, that looks pretty good. You can play with that though if you want. Now, one of the things that I noticed is that right now we have our 3D particles, but then we have our shadow, and our shadow is on top of the particles. So what we need is actually, we need to do the same kind of thing we did right here. So we need this alpha to make sure that the shadows aren't on top of the pixels. And we can do that by just grabbing these particles and put it into the mask here, and option click, just to make it a little bit more organized. And in the merge, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take the apply mask inverted. There we go. And now the particles are out in front of that shadow. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good. Let's do a quick render just to see where we are, and then we can always do changes whatever you want to do. Okay, so we just did a quick little render. Let's just play it through. Yeah, I mean, not bad. I feel like it could use a little bit more oomph, but still it works pretty well. I feel like it could use a much stronger explosion. Let me see what we can do about that. In the emitter, let's go to the controls, and then I just feel like it doesn't go up enough. Where's the, let's bring that velocity up a little bit more. Maybe that'll do it. What does that do? Bring that velocity up. There we go. That really pushes them out. Okay, so you can play around with this, but I think you get the idea. So if we wanted a bigger explosion, I went to the velocity point here, and I brought that up to 0.5, and that really gives the particles more energy. Wait a minute. Why does it look like the particles are going through the wall? They are going through the wall. So I'm glad this happened, because something happened here, right? We have particles going through the wall. Why is that? Let's see. I'm just going to temporarily put this 3D scene in here. Oh, that's why. This wall isn't long enough, or it's not in the right place. You got your particles falling through the wall here, and that's because this needs to be down more and probably longer. So in here, transform X. Oh yeah, that should be like 8. There we go. And actually this other one too, let's make it a lot longer, just to make sure that those particles don't fall through. Okay. The particle's actually going. Okay, that's much better. Okay. Anyway, so let's unhook this again, look through this merge, and let's kind of see what we got so far. Okay, that's looking pretty good. A couple last things I almost forgot about. If we come up to the emitter in the style, let's turn on subpixel rendering, and that way it's gonna take a little bit longer to render, but it's gonna give us a much smoother render of our particles. And the other thing we want to do is in the renderer for the particles, let's click on that. Let's go over to the settings and let's turn on the motion blur, because we need a little bit of that motion blur, and that's just going to really make it look much nicer. Okay, yeah, that looks really nice. Just adds that little bit of extra detail I think that was lacking in the previous render. So with those set, let's render it one last time just to check and make sure everything looks good. Okay, and once that's done, let's just press play and see what we got. So just with a few more tweaks, I think we got a really nice render. Now we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more that you can do with particles, but I've been running a little long today. If you have any questions or problems, let me know in the comments. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.